Ralph Waldo Emerson. I want to talk about the American scholar and Self-Reliance, two of his famous essays. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of Emerson before, but you have to think of him within the genre of transcendentalism. And American transcendentalism is the American expression of Romanticism, but Romanticism as a religion in America. Let me give you a little background. New England first was populated by the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and they came to they became New England. And they believed they were Calvinists. They were Trinitarian Orthodox people who really cared about predestination, the authority of the Bible. They wanted a pure, unadulterated version of the Reformation, particularly Calvin's version of the Reformation. After about three or four generations, though, the Puritans turned into what you call Congregationalists. And to scale it back, it was just Puritanism, but with a little less intensity. And then after a few generations, Puritans in the vicinity of Harvard, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Boston, Massachusetts, turned themselves became what we call a Unitarian. Now, this is basically Puritanism become Congregationalism mixed with John Locke, mixed with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And what the Unitarians wanted to do was they wanted religion. They still wanted to be Christian. They still thought of themselves as Christians, but they want to think about like a filter, like a coffee filter, right? All of knowledge goes through this filter. You withhold stuff you don't like, and you only let stuff that you like pass through. And the filter out anything that didn't conform to reason and evidence. They believed in the Bible. They believed that the Bible was the Word of God. But they thought everything we know about the Bible, all theology, has to go through the filter of evidence and reason, and then things are empirical. And one of the big things that they cared about was the idea of the Trinity. They thought, look, 1 plus 1 does not equal 1. It cannot be 3. This whole Trinity stuff, the idea that there's 3 and 1 of 3 is just hogwash. It's goofy. It makes absolutely no sense. And furthermore, and they're right about this actually, the word Trinity never shows up in the Bible. So they thought, no, this is just weird superstitious stuff from the past. What they thought was there's this guy named Jesus, and he preached this pure religion. And what happened was he dies. They believe he died and was resurrected, went to heaven. He was a prophet and a messenger from God. But along the way, his followers, after his death, kept adulterating, corrupting, and mixing up his religion, which was all this paganism, all this weird, superstitious, goofy, occult pagan stuff. And then they invented all sorts of weird rituals, and they turned it into, and one of the things they invented, which made absolutely no sense, was a Trinity. Again, 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 3. The idea that this beloved, beautiful man, they elevated him to the level of God or co-God with God the Father. They were biblical. They read the Bible. And by the way, they thought that the New Testament was authoritative. It was the Word of God. They believed it was a guy named Jesus who was the Son of God. He was a prophet of God. They believed he actually performed real miracles, which validated and justified and proved that he actually was who he said he was. And then they also thought that he did die and was resurrected and went to heaven, to sit at the right hand of the Father. They thought that was all true. What they did not believe was that he was a son of God. He was a co-God. Yes, it just did not conform to reason. Now, what they meant by it, but they thought it was the Son of God and just not another God. Now, what do they mean by that? They don't really explain. They don't really explain what that means. But again, they're willing to leave enough to mystery, but they just don't want anything to go against reason. They thought the Old Testament had some truth into it, but the Jews were just primitive and weird and pagan and just not very smart. So they read the New Testament as authoritative because the miracles proved that Jesus was who he was, and the Old Testament needs to be read with a massive grain of salt or altered through a filter of reason. Okay, so Harvard and their vicinity, New England, all these Christians, but they're really mum about they just don't talk about Jesus as Son of God, as a Messiah, as a co-God, but Jesus as the Son of God, the Messiah, and his revelation is authoritative. And you think of these people as very rich, very classy, very elegant people, not too emotional, very even-keeled, your typical New England Yankee. Out of this, though, comes a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he is a Unitarian. He is a Unitarian pastor, but he rebels against this world, and he gives a speech, and basically all hell breaks loose, and he becomes a transcendentalist. Now, what is a transcendentalist? He basically starts off as transcendentalism is like a break off from. So think of Unitarianism is a splinter away from traditional Trinitarian orthodoxy. Transcendentalism then is like a splinter away from Unitarianism. It's a massive rupture. Now, Unitarians actually hate the Transcendentalists, and the Transcendentalists really hate the Unitarians. But again, genetically, though, is a split off from Transcendentalism. What you get a sense of a Transcendentalist from the American Scholar and the essay on self-reliance. But what the Transcendentalists hate is the idea of orthodoxy, being rigid, being handed down a set of doctrines and saying, you must believe in these things. Rather, they think that one should always pursue truth all the time. One is always, one is never a being, one is always becoming. The truth is in a perpetual state of being discovered constantly. They did not like this idea that there's a pope with dogma and doctrine from a long time ago, and it has been given to you, and you must yield and submit to this authority unthinkingly and critically. In many ways, just as the Unitarians were critically questioning the dogma that was given to them by the Trinitarians, the Congregationalists who used to be Puritans, in many ways, it's like the chickens have come home to roost. As much as the Unitarians hated the Transcendentalists, one could argue the Transcendentalists were the natural offshoot, the natural consequence of the seed form of this kind of rebellion in Unitarianism. So rather than like going to church and learning stuff that you've inherited from your authorities, from your betters, from the hierarchy and the past, as we've discussed before, a transcendentalist might say something like this: you should just sort of be open to the spirit of God. They were like borderline pantheists. They believed God was everywhere, especially in nature. Again, think Werther. Okay, transcendentalists are like Werther, like romantics, turned into a religion in New England. If Werther created a religion, it would be transcendentalism. So a transcendentalist like Emerson, or and later Thoreau, another famous one. They're people that would just like this is how they'd worship. Okay, they don't go to church. They don't have doctrine. They don't have dogma. They don't have a Bible. They would like say go off in the woods all by yourself and just smell, feel, hear, be present. It reminds me a lot of the mindfulness stuff. Like be mindful, be aware, and just listen. God is in nature, and just absorb God through nature. And what is God telling you? Is in the text, is in logic, is in all these old musty books. No. God is alive right now, right now, and revelation is happening at this moment constantly. You're experiencing God's revelation, and whatever God is telling you is the truth. And no one is to tell you you're wrong. Upon what authority are you telling me that I'm wrong? Because you're older than me, you're richer than me, you're wiser than me, you work at Harvard and have a degree and a bunch of capital letters after your last name. That makes you right? No, we say my authority is in my immediate experience of revelation from God. God is talking to me right now through nature itself. And there's something deeply corrupting and deviant about anyone who will tell me otherwise. So that is what a transcendentalist is. In both these essays, there's a big spirit of what you call rebellion and anti-chauvinism of the past. There is a chauvinism and reliance on the present. And in many ways, I think this would be really good to think through a great books program like the Honors College. Think about what we do in the Honors College, right? And you're given, there's this thing called the Western Canon, right? We have a whole massive pile of great books, that you're subjected to reading. And, in many ways, we expect students in schools like this or programs like this to be somewhat docile. And I don't mean that in an insulting way, but it's like a catechism. We're giving to you this canon. By the way, the canon of the Bible, and almost as sacred as a canon of the Western books of the Western civilization. And we sort of assume that they're authoritative, partly because, why do we have a Western canon? What fits in the Western canon? We could talk about this later on, but one argument is simply, look, through the filter of really smart people through a couple thousand years, these are the things that have been preserved by great minds. And now you get to inherit all this stuff, right? And we don't really want you to rebel against it. We just ask you to take it. And so in some sense, you submit yourself to the tutelage of your professors, who have a lot of capital letters after their last name. And we expect you to submit yourself to the tutelage of all these great books from the past. And say, you must, eat of this, drink of this, absorb it. And in many ways, we then ask you to write papers that imitate these great books, reflect on these great books, and maybe allow it to transform you. Okay, the kind of great books we've given you in some ways, as many ways of the great books that Emerson and was given. That is a Harvard curriculum. That's a classical curriculum. But Emerson wants to ask the audacious question: why? No, why do we think these books are great? And his answer is, once upon a time, these great writers, they're not like inspired by God. They were young men, just like we were young men once, and they wrote stuff. And at the time, it was accepted as good. But then it was passed down as good through a kind of doctrine to the next generation upon the next generation. And they turned these great books, which were finally good at the time, into something they were never meant to be, which is elevated to the level of doctrine and authority and should never be questioned. He's saying they're just young people, or just people in general. They're just mere mortals who wrote stuff down that they're amusing, exploring ideas, trying to do the best they can. But it was good for them. It was never intended to be good for all time, all places, some transcendent way. Emerson is actually opposed to reading. He's opposed to that kind of education. But hold back. I think he wants to read books, but he doesn't want to read books the way we read, or the way his peers in his generation read books. Rather, what he says is a book is only good to the extent that it helps you right here, right now, come up with your own ideas. Meaning there's no difference between the great Cicero and Goethe and Shakespeare of the past and you. You're just as great. Kind of like the whole religion thing. You don't believe in God just because someone 2,000 years ago said this is who God is. They came up with an idea about God. Great, good for them. Now you're alive right now. You come up with an idea for God. In other words, be original. Come up with your own ideas. Don't be lazy. To rely on the authority of the past is a form of intellectual laziness.